The sun dipped low over Willow Creek as Mark Bennett stood in front of the house where he'd grown up. The once grand two-story home seemed smaller now, its faded blue paint peeling under years of neglect. The porch creaked softly in the breeze, and the railing sagged slightly, a silent testament to time. Mark adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder, his muscles reflexively tensed. Years in the Marines had made him vigilant, though nothing could prepare him for this homecoming. 3 tours overseas had reshaped him, yet he'd naively expected Willow Creek to remain unchanged. The key was exactly where his mother always left it, under a chipped terracotta planter by the steps. As Mark unlocked the door, a wave of familiar scents, stale wood, a hint of baking, and something faintly dusty, washed over him, catching him off guard. It had been nearly 2 months since his parents' tragic car accident, an out-of-control truck on a stormy night that had taken both their lives. Now, standing in the empty house, Mark felt the crushing weight of silence. The neighborhood looked different too. As he unpacked his few belongings in the old living room, the low growl of engines echoed faintly down the block. Curious, Mark stepped to the window. A group of bikers rumbled past on matte black motorcycles, deliberately revving their engines. A middle-aged man hurried his dog across the street as the bikers laughed. This wasn't the quiet, friendly suburb Mark remembered. That evening, as Mark sorted through his father's old desk in the study, there was a knock at the door. He opened it to find Mrs. Carter, his childhood neighbor. She held a covered dish, her smile kind but uncertain. Her once blonde hair had gone silver, and her frail hands shook slightly as she offered the casserole. "Mark," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's good to see you again. I'm so sorry about your folks. They were the best neighbors anyone could ask for." Mark accepted the dish, touched by the simple act of kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. It means a lot." They sat on the porch as the sun set, and Mrs. Carter updated him on the changes in Willow Creek. The quiet little town had shifted ever since a group called the Iron Serpents moved in 6 months ago. The bikers had purchased the old Millard property at the edge of town and converted it into their clubhouse. "Their trouble, Mark," Mrs. Carter said, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Loud parties, vandalism, and those motorcycles. They've made everyone nervous, but what can we do? A few people have tried to speak up, but," she trailed off, glancing nervously toward the street, her fear plain as day. Mark studied her closely, her darting eyes, the flinch in her voice at the sound of a distant engine. This wasn't the confident woman who used to scold him for accidentally trampling her garden as a boy. Something was very wrong here. That night, as Mark sat in his father's weathered armchair, the faint hum of engines and distant shouting seeped through the windows. Years of military training had taught him to listen, observe, and analyze. He'd spent his career defending others in far-off places, yet now, for the first time, the threat was close to home. The next morning, Mark fell into an old habit, jogging at dawn. As he ran past familiar streets, he spotted the gang's mark everywhere: graffiti on fences, shattered glass near the park playground, and trash cans tipped over like some cruel joke. A weary older man crossed to the other side of the road when he saw Mark, mistaking him for one of the bikers because of his broad shoulders and military build. Back at home, Mark booted up his laptop and began digging. The Iron Serpents were no small-town nuisance. They had a history in other communities, minor disturbances at first, but then property damage, theft, and rumors of something darker, drugs and extortion. Local news articles hinted at connections to crime rings, though charges had never stuck. Sipping his coffee on the front porch later that day, Mark watched as the neighborhood came to life. Kids waited at the corner for the school bus. Mrs. Carter watered her flowers under careful watch, disappearing quickly inside when a biker sped past. He heard a crash and startled cries down the block. 2 members of the Serpents were laughing as they shoved trash cans into the street, right in front of a group of nervous schoolchildren. Mark's grip tightened around his coffee cup. He'd seen bullies before, on playgrounds, in war zones, and now here in Willow Creek. If the Iron Serpents thought they could terrorize people without consequence, they'd underestimated the wrong man. Mark scanned the bikers instinctively, noting their positions, stances, and weapons, just as he'd done countless times in combat. These weren't fighters, they were thugs, used to bullying people too afraid to push back. Mark's voice remained calm, but firm. "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said, his words slicing through the tense silence. "You're 3 members of the Iron Serpents, a gang with a history of harassing the elderly and shaking down small businesses. You've been operating here for 6 months. He turned his sharp gaze to the leader, a man with a red bandana. "Patrick Miller, better known as Snake. 2 years in county for assault." Snake's smug grin vanished. Mark nodded toward the bulky man cracking his knuckles. "And you, Robert Johnson, better known as Tank. Wanted for extortion in 2 states." Finally, he looked at the wiry man with a snake tattoo slithering up his neck. "Michael Peters. Viper. Outstanding warrant for possession." Mark stepped forward, his military instincts locked in. "The past week, I've documented everything. Every threat, every act of vandalism, every payment you've extorted. Photos, videos, timestamps, it's all there." Snake exchanged nervous glances with the others. This wasn't the usual script. "So here's how this goes," Mark continued, his voice lower and more dangerous. "You're going to leave Mrs. Carter alone. In fact, you're going to leave everyone in this neighborhood alone." Tank stepped forward, cracking his knuckles menacingly. "Or what, tough guy? Or I send my evidence to every law enforcement agency in this state. State police, federal agents, doesn't matter. One phone call, and your entire operation comes crashing down." Mark pulled out his phone for emphasis. "Want me to call Captain Ramirez at the state police? He's on speed dial." Snake's bravado wavered. "You're bluffing," he growled, but his voice lacked conviction. Mark raised his eyebrows. "Try me." For a long moment, none of the bikers moved. Finally, Snake sneered, though the threat in his tone rang hollow. "This ain't over, soldier boy." "Yes, it is," Mark replied flatly. "Unless you want to explain to your boss how you let his whole operation get exposed." The bikers retreated, trying to keep up their tough appearances, but Mark could see the unease in their movements. Behind him, Mrs. Carter let out a shaky breath. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I haven't seen anyone stand up to them like that." Mark helped her clean up the broken flower pot, his voice calm but resolute. "It's not over yet, Mrs. Carter. They'll come back. But this time, we'll be ready." The news of Mark Bennett's confrontation spread quickly through Willow Creek. That evening, as Mark installed security cameras around his property, he noticed curtains twitching as neighbors watched him. Some gave him small nods of approval, others looked uneasy, fearful of what might come next. At sunset, Mr. Carter from the local grocery store appeared at Mark's door with a brown paper bag. "These are on me," Mr. Carter said, keeping his voice low. "What you did today, nobody's done that before." He glanced nervously down the street. "But be careful. Their leader, Razor, isn't like the rest of them. He's smart. And meaner, too." "Thanks, Mr. Carter," Mark replied, taking the groceries. The old man's fear told him everything he needed to know about this Razor. That night, Mark sat in his darkened living room, watching the security camera feeds on his laptop. He'd seen this before. After a challenge, bullies always had 2 choices, retreat or escalate. Mark bet on escalation. He didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, the rumble of engines broke the stillness. 8 motorcycles pulled up outside his house, far more than earlier. Mark watched through his cameras as a tall man with a studded leather jacket stepped off his bike. Even from a distance, Razor's presence commanded attention. "So this is where the soldier lives," Razor's voice rang out, loud and taunting. He gestured to the cameras with a chuckle. "He's watching us, boys." The bikers laughed uneasily, but Mark noted the tension in their body language. Snake must have told them about their earlier encounter. Razor knocked loudly on Mark's front door. "Come on out, tough guy. Let's have a chat." Mark checked the cameras again, 3 bikers by the front yard, 2 near the garage, and the rest by their bikes, armed with chains, bats, and knives. They still underestimated him. Calmly, Mark opened the door. The porch light revealed Razor's scarred face and steely eyes. "Nice evening for a visit," Mark said, his tone quiet but steady. Razor smirked. "Heard you've been causing trouble for my boys. That's bad for business. Threatening old women and smashing windows. That's your business." Mark replied coolly. "Interesting career choice." Razor stepped closer, his smile turning cold. "Listen, soldier boy. This is our town now. Whatever you think you're doing, it ends tonight, or things get ugly." "I've seen ugly," Mark shot back. 3 tours in the Middle East. Ambushes, combat. What you're doing here? That's not ugly, that's just pathetic." Razor's smile disappeared. "You think that uniform makes you tough? Out here, the rules are different." "You're right," Mark agreed. "That's why I've sent all my evidence, videos, photos, names, to the right people. State Police, FBI. It's all documented, including your operation and your real name, Marcus Razor Rodriguez." Razor froze, his men shifting uncomfortably. They weren't used to seeing their leader outmaneuvered. Mark continued, his voice calm but firm. "Here's the deal, leave this neighborhood alone, or I'll bring everything crashing down around you." Razor studied Mark, his eyes cold with fury. "You just made a big mistake, soldier. You want war? I'll show you war." As the bikers roared off into the night, Mark stayed by the doorway, watching through his cameras. Some of Razor's men glanced back nervously. Doubt had started to seep in. From next door, Mrs. Carter called out, her voice trembling. "Mark? Are you okay?" "Everything's fine, Mrs. Carter," he assured her. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be an interesting day." The next morning, Mark woke to find his property vandalized. His father's old pickup had been destroyed, windows smashed, tires slashed. Red spray paint covered the garage door. "You're dead, soldier." Oil had been poured over his mother's beloved flower beds, the flowers left limp and lifeless. But what made Mark's jaw tighten wasn't the damage to his home, it was what he saw across the street. Every house on the block had been vandalized with similar threats, meant to turn the entire neighborhood against him. Mrs. Carter ran out in tears. "Mark, they broke into my house. They took Henry's medals, his military medals. It's all I had left of him. You know, son, sometimes the bravest battles are fought right here at home." Mark looked at the medals in his hand, thinking about those who had served and sacrificed before him. "The battle might be over," he said, "but the real work is just beginning. We've got a neighborhood to rebuild." 1 month later, Willow Creek looked like a town reborn. On a bright Saturday morning, Mark stood in Mrs. Carter's garden, helping her plant new roses to replace the ones the bikers had destroyed. "These will bloom beautifully come spring," she said, smiling as she glanced at her husband's medals, now gleaming in a glass display case on her mantel. They were a reminder of both past sacrifices and the fight they'd won together. Nearby, the once abandoned playground was alive with laughter. Children swung on repaired swings and climbed freshly painted slides, their parents watching from benches with relaxed smiles. Mr. Thompson, the grocer, had organized a community fund to repair the playground equipment, and families were finally letting their kids play outside again. At the edge of town, the old Iron Serpent's clubhouse had been transformed. With donations and support from local authorities, it was now a veterans resource center. Mark had suggested the idea after realizing how many former service members in the area needed help adjusting to civilian life. "This reminds me of how neighborhoods used to be," Mr. Jenkins said, carrying a tray of lemonade. "People looking out for each other instead of hiding behind locked doors." Mark nodded in agreement as Officer Ramirez's patrol car rolled by. Ramirez waved, his demeanor no longer nervous or unsure. These days, he helped run neighborhood watch programs and attended community meetings regularly. Business was thriving too. The grocery store's bell chimed cheerfully as Mr. Thompson opened up for the day. His shattered windows had been replaced, now displaying new signs that read, "Family owned. Community strong." Word of how Willow Creek stood up to the gang had spread, and people from neighboring towns now visited to shop and show support. "Mark," called Mrs. Peterson, who lived down the street. She hurried over with a smile. "Don't forget, the community meeting starts in an hour. We need your input on the new safety programs." Mark had made it his mission to teach self-defense classes and organize safety workshops. More importantly, he'd created a network where neighbors looked out for each other. On his way to the meeting, Mark passed his own home. The garage door, once spray-painted with threats, now proudly displayed a hand-painted American flag, a gift from the neighborhood kids. His father's old pickup truck, once vandalized, had been repaired by local mechanics who refused to take payment. "Just paying it forward," they'd told him. "You know, son, sometimes the bravest battles are fought right here at home." Mark looked at the medals in his hand, thinking about those who had served and sacrificed before him. "The battle might be over," he said, "but the real work is just beginning. We've got a neighborhood to rebuild." 1 month later, Willow Creek looked like a town reborn. On a bright Saturday morning, Mark stood in Mrs. Carter's garden, helping her plant new roses to replace the ones the bikers had destroyed. "These will bloom beautifully come spring," she said, smiling as she glanced at her husband's medals, now gleaming in a glass display case on her mantel. They were a reminder of both past sacrifices and the fight they'd won together. Nearby, the once abandoned playground was alive with laughter. Children swung on repaired swings and climbed freshly painted slides, their parents watching from benches with relaxed smiles. Mr. Thompson, the grocer, had organized a community fund to repair the playground equipment, and families were finally letting their kids play outside again. At the edge of town, the old Iron Serpent's clubhouse had been transformed. With donations and support from local authorities, it was now a veterans resource center. Mark had suggested the idea after realizing how many former service members in the area needed help adjusting to civilian life. "This reminds me of how neighborhoods used to be," Mr. Jenkins said, carrying a tray of lemonade. "People looking out for each other instead of hiding behind locked doors." Mark nodded in agreement as Officer Ramirez's patrol car rolled by. Ramirez waved, his demeanor no longer nervous or unsure. These days, he helped run neighborhood watch programs and attended community meetings regularly. Business was thriving too. The grocery store's bell chimed cheerfully as Mr. Thompson opened up for the day. His shattered windows had been replaced, now displaying new signs that read, "Family owned. Community strong." Word of how Willow Creek stood up to the gang had spread, and people from neighboring towns now visited to shop and show support. "Mark," called Mrs. Peterson, who lived down the street. She hurried over with a smile. "Don't forget, the community meeting starts in an hour. We need your input on the new safety programs." Mark had made it his mission to teach self-defense classes and organize safety workshops. More importantly, he'd created a network where neighbors looked out for each other. On his way to the meeting, Mark passed his own home. The garage door, once spray-painted with threats, now proudly displayed a hand-painted American flag, a gift from the neighborhood kids. His father's old pickup truck, once vandalized, had been repaired by local mechanics who refused to take payment. Just paying it forward, they'd told him. The community center buzzed with energy. Faces once marked by fear were now full of pride and determination. Before the meeting began, Mrs. Carter, who'd been named community board president, stood to make an announcement. "I just got a call from the state prosecutor," she said. "Razor and his gang have pleaded guilty. With the evidence Mark helped gather, they're facing long sentences. They won't be troubling anyone again." Applause erupted across the room. Mark sat quietly in the back, letting the moment sink in. He remembered his father's words, "Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that bring people together." The meeting turned to plans for a new community garden, after-school programs, and an emergency response network. What had started as a fight against a gang had become something much bigger, a revival of the town's spirit. After the meeting, Mark walked home with Mrs. Carter. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when you first came back, I was afraid you'd brought the war home with you. But instead, you brought back something we'd lost, courage to stand together." Mark smiled, watching the sunset turn the streets golden. His military training had taught him how to fight, but it had also shown him the importance of protecting what matters most. In far-off places, he'd fought for ideals, freedom, justice, safety. Here, he'd fought for something tangible, the right for his neighbors to live without fear. As evening fell, the neighborhood came alive with warmth and peace. Families sat on their porches, children played tag in the yards, and the soft hum of conversations filled the air. The iron serpents were gone, but they'd left behind something unexpected, a stronger, more united community. Mark sat on his porch, watching the quiet streets, knowing his work wasn't done. Tomorrow, there'd be another self-defense class to teach, more progress on the Veteran Center, and plans to finalize for the town's first community festival. The soldier in him had found a new mission, not to fight wars, but to build peace. One neighborhood at a time.